Today we're going to talk about collaboration, but in a slightly different way. It's not about vanilla ice, so apologies if that's why you joined. Feel free to leave. No hard feelings if that's what you're hoping for. It's a slightly different topic. So I'm a product consultant. I work for a consulting firm called Consulting. We're based in Richmond, but we're sort of distributed across the East Coast. And we are really passionate about this idea of embracing asynchronous communication patterns. And so today, we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to be asynchronous, why this way of working and this way of collaborating can be helpful to you and your team and your organization, sort of regardless of your context. And mostly we'll spend our time talking about how we do it. My goal for you is to have sort of a toolkit at the end of this hour of ways to sort of move the needle towards a more asynchronous reality for you and your teams. Quick housekeeping, this QR code, I'll have it again at the end, and I'll put a link to where it leads in the chat as well. But this is this form will take you to a way to connect directly with me. If anything I say today feels like it's something that you would absolutely like to put into practice, but you're just not really sure like how to go about it at your organization, we can connect and I can give you some free resources, some guides, some one-on-one help for how to do that. Either myself or somebody else at N- would be more than happy to connect with you. Hopefully we have time at the end for question and answer, but if we don't, this is a great way to sort of engage with me in that space. So let me grab the link and put it in the chat. Okay, here we go. That's how to connect. Okay, great. So let's start by sort of defining what it means to be asynchronous. So asynchronous is not remote by another name. It often gets conflated with remote, and there is certainly a lot of overlap in that particular Venn diagram, but they are not the same thing. Asynchronous just means that we are exchanging information without having to be present and engaged at the same time. So it's the opposite of synchronous. So think phone call, synchronous communication, pretty any place that you don't have that direct one-on-one is asynchronous. This type of communication is marked by some key characteristics, and we're going to look at these characteristics today and sort of maybe unpack some preconceived biases, either for or against them, and talk about how they can be beneficial for us. So the first, sort of maybe inherent and obvious, is a delayed response. In our culture today, where everything is about like building more and doing more and being faster and being better, the idea of like a delayed response may seem super negative, but hopefully by the end of our time together, you will feel that it is not super negative and that there's some real benefits to pausing and taking a moment before responding, and also having sort of like the expectation that there will be a delayed response and sort of baking that into the way that we think about collaborating with our teammates and the way we think about one another's time and respect for that time. Second key characteristic is flexibility. This one feels inherently positive, but it can be scary to people. A lot of people like structure and rigidity, but the idea that we can look for places to be flexible in spaces where historically there has been a lot of prescriptive guidance. So delayed response, flexibility, and then this is kind of a happy byproduct of communicating asynchronously. More often than not, when you're communicating asynchronously, it's in a written medium. So you sort of have this inherent documentation as a byproduct of embracing this way of collaboration, in a way that you don't have when you have a face-to-face conversation or a meeting or a phone call. So that's what it is. And you probably are doing it already. So let's just do like a quick show of hands. You can do emoji hands or hand raises. How many of you think that you are already engaging asynchronously day to day on your teams today? A lot of hands, a lot of thumbs up. Okay, great. Yeah. I mean, if you send an email, that is an example of asynchronous communication. It's kind of the OG of asynchronous communication. I feel like we found a lot of ways to get away from talking to each other in email, but in a lot of ways, it's tried and true. And a lot of us kind of revert back to that ultimately. So you are already, to some degree, sort of embracing this mindset. And all we're talking about today is how do we continue to move the needle towards more asynchronous collaboration and away from real time all the time. So it's for everybody. It's for all teams. We obviously think about using this way of engagement on remote teams because we're not in the same space. So by virtue of that, we have to be really proactive. We can't just pop by someone's cube to have a conversation in a remote team. But it's not limited to remote teams by any stretch of the imagination. Certainly, asynchronous communication is well suited for in-office teams, for teams that are distributed globally, for leadership teams, product teams, development teams. You get the sense, right? Every team, your team. So it's for you, you know what it is. And so the next question is kind of like, why should I work this way? And we're going to dive into this a lot. But most importantly, I believe that asynchronous collaboration is sort of like the next paradigm shift. Remote is not new, right? We've all been either forced into it or gleefully skipped into the reality of remote work as part of our daily existence. Some of us are having it peeled out of our clenched fists as we speak, the flexibility to work remotely. But the idea of working asynchronously and collaborating asynchronously, to me, is sort of the next paradigm shift. It's a strategic approach that is really the sort of the keystone to maximize the potential of all teams. A lot of us are doing lift and shift remote, where we have all the same realities of the office just at our kitchen table or living room couch. But the idea of sort of leveraging asynchronous collaboration, I think, is where we can really truly start to maximize the potential of this hybrid world that we live in. So you may be all on board about this, but asynchronous is not something that you can just do by yourself. You need a little bit of infrastructure. So I find it helpful to start with the why. Hopefully you can take this back to the skeptics at your organization, or if you yourself as a skeptic, maybe I can start to help convince you as to like what the benefit is of working this way. So it sort of offers us two F's: flexibility, gains in flexibility, and gains in focus. So we have flexibility in schedule. I'm going to throw out a buzzword. So if you have your bingo card, check it off. But it gives us flexibility in work-life balance. If you have wall-to-wall meetings 9 to 5 every day of the week, the ability to like chaperone a field trip or go volunteer at lunch duty or take your dog to a training class, take a hot yoga class in the middle of the morning to center your chi. Those things become a little bit less attainable. And you may think like, there's no room for that in my workday. But at N-, and I would argue that a lot of other places, we believe that you're your whole self at work. And so the better and happier that you feel at work, the better and happier the work that you do is. It makes you a more sustainably efficient employee if you are able to sort of strike your own work-life balance. So if you have time in your day that you're free from the expectation of synchronous collaboration and synchronous availability, you start to be able to have more flexibility in how you spend your day. Now, maybe your organization is not in a place where they can accept the fact that you're offline for an hour doing hot yoga in the morning, and they think, nope, that's not going to work. Regardless of that, if you have the expectation to be online from 9 to 5, moving some of your work into asynchronous collaboration patterns allows you to start to think more intentionally about time in your day dedicated completely to focused downtime, heads downtime, and time in your day dedicated to synchronous collaboration. Because one of the things that we'll talk about later is like the fact that we are constantly being pulled in a million different directions. So if we're intentional in the way we schedule our day and know that we have time to have heads down time, it makes us able to be more sort of focused during that synchronous and present during that synchronous collaboration time. So we get flexibility there to say like, these are my hours that I'm dedicated to heads down. It also gives us some flexibility in location. So this first one is probably a no-brainer. If I'm working asynchronously and collaborating where I don't need both people present, I am able to collaborate with somebody across the globe. I have a coworker who may or may not be on this call who is on the other coast, and he starts his day super early to accommodate East Coast schedule times. With more asynchronous flexibility, he might be able to start his day not at 4 a.m. his time and maybe at 9 a.m. his time. More mature teams need less overlap. That overlap to have synchronous communication within time zones is really helpful for teams who are sort of just starting off in this journey. But the ability to sort of not have to be online at the same time as your teammates and still move things across the finish line is incredibly powerful and gives us great flexibility in who we can hire and who we can task with certain responsibilities. Something that may not come as readily to mind in this space is also the ability to sort of work in a physical location where our productivity and creativity are maximized. So, for example, if I'm a web designer and I'm working on Figma designs for a new user experience for my product, I may find that my creativity is most fueled when I'm outside or maybe looking at water or, having the sun shine on me. So if I know that I have 2 or 3 hours in an afternoon where there's no expectation for me to be synchronously available to my teammates, I may choose to move my workstation to a place where my creativity is better fueled. Certainly, this isn't appropriate for maybe like stand up or maybe a leadership readout, but it gives me the flexibility to pick the location best suited for the work that I have at that moment. And then lastly, it offers us flexibility and contributions. I've recently been working on a client where shared language, a shared express language is not a given. And so the ability for people to participate who maybe are a little bit more hesitant to participate in like real-time rapid fire moments, moving our work to asynchronous collaboration allows those people to contribute in a way that they maybe aren't able to in real time. It also sort of considers folks who are neurodivergent in some way. It gives them the sort of flexibility to contribute in a meaningful way and gives them a different opportunity and a different medium for us to hear all the voices. Because, we know that diversity is a really powerful value driver at every organization. The more diverse points of views that we can consider, the better our solutions. So finding ways to bring those voices that we might not necessarily hear from in a real-time brainstorm session is a real powerful positive as to why we should start to think about collaborating this way. Okay, so flexibility in schedule, flexibility in where we work and where we hire, flexibility in who contributes and how they are able to contribute. Our second F was focus, sorry. Now, how do we gain in focus? So I alluded a little bit to this idea of task management. I don't know if your days are like mine, but I feel like I'm always being pulled in a million different directions. There's a ton of research out there about the cost of context switching. I have heated, spirited debates about the multitasking or multi-failing fallacy with some of my coworkers all the time. But the science tells us that our brains are not physically able to do more than one thing at one time. So if we are multitasking, we are definitely not doing those two tasks as well as we could be doing one of those tasks at a time. And so having time in our day to simply focus on the artifacts that we have due and not be answering a Slack message or responding to an email or joining a meeting a couple minutes late or catching somebody else up on a meeting they didn't go to because they were triple booked. We are able to start to really focus more and create more meaningful work. And along with that, more innovative work, right? The ability to focus on one thing at a time allows for us to do those things better, to be more creative and to be more innovative in what it is that we're producing. And then I'm sure none of you have ever had like a heated meeting at work, but sometimes when we're talking about things that we're passionate about, because if we're a passionate professional, there are going to be times where we're passionate about and passionately disagreeing with the people that we work with. We may say something that we don't mean, or we may say something that is just inaccurate. So if we can move some of that pre-work and some of that collaboration ahead of the meeting or after the meeting to an asynchronous space, we have the ability to like not just guess and speak off the cuff or speak from just a completely impassioned place, but rather from an informed and well-researched and thoughtful place. So our responses inherently become a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more well-researched. Okay, so we've got flexibility, we've got focus, and how do we go about doing these things? And so we're going to talk, like I said, promise most of our time is going to be spent on this how. How do we implement it? And for me, I think that it's easy to remember the 4 M's. We're going to talk about how we do this with messaging. We're going to talk about how we do this with meetings, how we use our mindset to do this, and how we make this natural at our organizations. And so we're going to start with messaging first, because I think this is one of the biggest things that we deal with in our day. Do me a favor and put in the chat the tool or tools that you use for messaging. So is it Teams? Is it Slack? Is it something else? So let's see what we got here. What do we have? And yes, Steve, absolutely. Starbucks is a great place to fuel your creativity. Okay, so we've got a lot of Slacks, a lot of Teams. Anybody using both? I've been on a client recently that's using both Slack and Teams, which is just a wonderful adventure. So I don't know how old we are all here, but some of us may remember AOL instant messaging, which was instant messaging, right? You got your CD in the mail, you put it in the drive, you dialed up, and you chatted real time. When your light turned green, you chatted real time, and that was instant messaging. I think in some ways we've taken that mindset of instant messaging and we've applied it to these messaging tools that we use at work. And honestly, to our own detriment. Okay, so these messaging tools, without any type of guardrails, in my oh so humble opinion, I think are the worst thing about synchronous and asynchronous communication. It's really like the worst way to collaborate with each other. And so let's dive in. Like, what does that feel like? So when we think about real-time messaging, which is, like I said, how most of us are likely using it today, we have maybe like, anybody ever have good morning? And then there's just dots. It's like a sort of an emotional feeler to see, like, are you available to really give me your undivided attention right now? So we sit there and we wait for the person to respond immediately. We have an expectation that they are going to respond to us right away because we're approaching this tool like it's an instant message. And we really, unless you're at an organization that's already really contemplated a lot of this and has rules in place, you have no visibility into that receiver's current status. Are they in a meeting? Are they heads down? Their light might be red, but maybe their light's always red. You don't really know. So as the sender, we sort of start to get this increased anxiety of like, why aren't they responding to me? Are they mad? Did I say something? We start reading back in the chat, like, did I offend them yesterday? Are they ignoring me? So that's how we feel as a sender in this real-time messaging world. As a recipient of that, of those messages, especially that good morning, right? You get that good morning, and then you close all your other windows, you navigate to Slack, and you wait, and you wait, and you wait. And depending on how much you have due that day and how much you have going on, you're frustrated with that person and their level, right? If it's the CTO, you might feel differently than if it's the new kid that you just hired. But the reality is that you're frustrated by that. Like, what do you want? Are you just saying good morning? Like, what do you want? So you feel this pressure to respond immediately. And you feel that way, not because probably anyone has said you must respond to Slack and Teams messages within 5 minutes. I'm sure that's not anybody's like workplace norm, but that's how we feel because there's an absence of actual norms and guidance for how to leverage these tools effectively. And so you have this annoyance at the intrusion and everything feels urgent. So that's messaging with zero guardrails in place. How do we fix this? So really a lot of this asynchronous collaboration is about being thoughtful and intentional in spaces where we've sort of just adopted whatever existed and we've just sort of slid into reality without really thinking about why we're doing things the way we're doing them. So the way we fix that is we start to pause and we think about what are some things we can put in place to undo some of those natural feelings of frustration and pressure that we feel when we're using these messaging apps. So one is to like schedule messages to send at a later point in time. That's a really powerful thing to do. If you happen to be working at 10 o'clock at night, it's maybe not great to send that to somebody at 10 o'clock at night. So maybe you send it to send first thing in the next morning. Or if you see that somebody is focused or heads down and you have a norm in place that actually means something, you send it for whenever they say they're going to be free. I came across a coworker who received an email from someone that said in the middle of the night, and the signature line said, I sent this message at a time when it was convenient for me. Please respond at a time when it's convenient for you. Seems very simple. It's just her signature line, but it sort of breaks the unspoken rule of everything is urgent, everything is ASAP. We very much live in that world. So sometimes all it takes is a simple sentence to say, hey, this is not on fire. I just wanted to get your thoughts. So something as simple as that can be a way to sort of break that unintentionality and just be intentional. Encourage respect for response times, like on your team, right? Encourage respect and say like, we have set these team norms and we know that people are not going to be available all the time. So respect their response times. And we'll talk a little bit about how as recipients of messages, you can help guide that as well. Because if you just never respond to Slack, that doesn't work either, because then you're sort of not being like a good partner on the other side. And then mostly, right, this is really a key. Implement guidelines for how to indicate the urgency of a communication. Maybe you have an emoji at the front. We'll talk about emojis later. I know there's mixed feelings. Maybe you have an emoji at the front that says like, it's a red light or a flashing light that says, this is urgent. We need you to respond right away. Maybe you preface your Slack message or your Teams message with, for your situational awareness. And that means that like, I don't have to respond right away. I can take a look at it later. Or if I see like urgent or for decision, maybe I react a different way. So you can build those things into your teams and just sort of have a meeting to talk about it, to set it once. And then that's how you guys conduct your business when you're reaching out to focus teammates. So on the other side of that same coin, how do we create boundaries for ourselves in the space of being unavailable on these instant message, or sorry, I said it wrong, on these messaging tools that are not instant messaging tools? How do we be unavailable? So one thing that you can do as a team is you can have standard heads down periods within the team. And a lot of times when I talk to people about this especially, people say, oh, that's so great if you're a little startup over there, but how do I do this in my huge organization where I have all these different needs? So I worked at a really big bank, and one of the things that we did within our space was the developers had like from 1 to 4 every day as heads down time. And so what that meant is as a team, we didn't schedule time with our engineers during that heads down time. There might have been a time where I would like need to pull a tech lead to meet with the business during that time because the executive's available when the executive is available. Some things are not going to change overnight. And so, but that was the exception to the rule. And the engineers had the confidence of that standard heads down time to say, I can't meet with you then. That's my focus time. So by having that infrastructure in place, it gave the engineers sort of the power and the autonomy to say, sorry, like our team norm is this. Can you reschedule that to a time when is not my focus time? And again, this is not like an all or nothing thing. These are ways to sort of start to gently move the needle in the direction of having time within your day to like do the work that you've been assigned to do. This may be difficult if you are like a support team or you're a team that's like very customer facing. One way that you can get around that is to sort of, if you have a channel or event or an email inbox or something that always has to be monitored, you can rotate the coverage of that. So it's kind of like you're on call during the workday, or maybe Monday is my day to cover the Slack channel. So I don't get focus time on Monday, but Tuesday through Friday I do, because my teammates are taking turns covering that external facing channel, whatever form it may take. And then another really great thing to do is to leverage the settings within these tools that they already have. Both Slack and Teams have the ability to set like do not disturb. You can even add detail about what that do not disturb means, because like if you're always on do not disturb, then people are going to interrupt you, right? Like, oh, it doesn't matter. They're always on do not disturb. It doesn't mean anything. So if you say something, you have to give people hope, right? So like if you say, I'm heads down until 3, I'll be responding to Slack messages then. If it's urgent, like please call me. Although depending on what generation you work with, some younger generations are never going to answer the phone. So just get over that. But maybe you have a way for people to reach you with urgent messages. But you say like, I'm heads down until this time. So you can put all of that in your like status on these messaging apps, so that way people know, oh, okay, like I'll reach out to them later. And maybe they find the answer in the meantime, while they're not bothering you. And for your part, you also have to sort of silence your notifications, right? So that you aren't disturbed by those chats if and when they do come. And then another mindful way that you can do this is differentiate between away and do not disturb. Like if you're away, then that's one thing. Whereas if you're focused, that's another thing. So again, be intentional about the features that are baked into these apps. And I want you to remember that, because some people may be thinking right now, like, there's no way I'm going to be that transparent with my coworkers about like where I am or what I'm doing. And that speaks probably to the culture that maybe you're facing. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of mindset when we get to that part, about how we have to treat that data if we're given it. Okay, so what that leads to, if we start to contemplate these strategies and start to put some of these norms and these things in place on our teams, we move to a really different experience with messaging. So we move from this real-time messaging world where everything is urgent and you feel like you're available all the time and therefore distracted all the time, to a place where, as a sender, I'm being really clear and concise when I'm sending communication. I'm prioritizing and considering what I'm going to put in a message versus an email versus a comment on a Google Doc, right? I'm going to be really thoughtful about the way I'm engaging with my teammate. Everything is in a Slack. Everything is in a Teams message. I'm going to lean on whatever team norms we put in place around the urgency of messages. And I'm going to make sure that I'm honoring the medium in which I'm sending the message, because it might be that the medium is what dictates the urgency. And if that's the case, I want to make sure that I'm using the tools appropriately according to the norms that we've set as a team. And most importantly, this will require a mindset shift for a lot of folks. I'm going to be respectful of receivers' response time. So I talked about on the first slide the idea of a delayed response, that might require us to think a little bit differently about how we interact with each other. But response time and being understanding of our receivers' response time is a really big piece there. And it requires us as senders of message to think about communication and collaboration a little differently. As a receiver of messages, it's important that I manage expectations. If I say I'm going to be back, I need to be back. If I say I'm going to be away, I need to be away. I'm going to respond clearly and in the urgency and priority in which messages were received. I'm going to apply my personal boundaries and maintain my focus schedule, because now it's not just me as an independent person ignoring everyone on Teams and Slack. I am intentionally honoring the focus time that we've agreed to as a team. And I have that infrastructure behind me to sort of support that choice to maybe not engage real time all the time. And then lastly, this is most important, I'm going to enforce the team's documented practices. And that's that was kind of what I was saying about that infrastructure. In the absence of that, I'm just one person that maybe people feel like are just ignoring me, that I'm just ignoring everyone. But now that we've talked about it as a team and we said, like, as a team, these are our focus hours, or as a team, this is our practice for when we have decided that when we're going to be heads down, or right, things like that. I'm able to, if somebody sort of breaches that, which guess what? They absolutely are. You can put these things in place and people are going to ignore them, mostly not on purpose, mostly not in a mean way, but just because it's such an inherent part of how we move through the workspace. And the reality is that when that happens, we are just going to have to say, hey, don't forget, we agreed as a team, we've set team level focus time. We agreed as a team that when we're heads down, we set a Slack message. So my Slack message was away and you messaged me back to back asking me for an urgent response. Like, that's not what we agreed to. So you kind of point to that document and say, this is what we said. It's just like any other team norm that we would agree on as an Agile, right? We come to stand up. That's a team norm. We don't message each other during focus time. That can be another team norm. Okay. So to move to a team level a little bit, some things to think about if you're a team lead or you're looking for how to get this going. And I think that answers the question I see in the chat. One way to do this is to sort of, you can dedicate channels based on team or topic. So maybe if there are things, that are urgent, we put it in one channel. So maybe that channel always has the notifications on, and anything that's not urgent, we put in another one. We saw this a lot when COVID started, right? A lot of teams like did water cooler channels or like cooking channels, but even like for work focused things, certainly there are things that have differing levels of urgency that are very work related. And so we can use channels to sort of differentiate that. And something to remember with these channels, until like Microsoft or Slack change their pricing model, these things are free. They're like slides, right? Spin them up, delete them as it suits you. A great example of this is I was working with a guy who was a QA tester, and he was saying like, I don't think you can do asynchronous collaboration for testing. Like, I really need to sit with the developer and like watch what it does and like have real time back and forth. And I respectfully disagree. I think that if you're releasing like 2 new features, you could create a channel for each feature, have the developer post the test cases, have the tester post the results. Maybe they clear like 90% of the functionality asynchronously, and they pull up for 15 minutes to like dissect a really gnarly part that isn't behaving the way it needs to. So we've gone from like maybe 4 hours of developer and QA synchronous time to maybe 30 minutes of that time. And all of a sudden, like, everybody has more flexibility in their schedule. So really think about, how can I use these channels to leverage asynchronous collaboration. Another thing that you can do as a whole team, this is a huge one, is threading. So using threads in Slack or conversations in Teams to keep exchanges grouped and easy to find later. Threading can be really difficult. I've worked with folks who maybe are a little bit averse to threading. And as a team, we decided like, hey, we were on this contract that had multiple consultancies. And we decided as a team that we were going to thread everything in the group channel. And it was not as adopted by everybody at the same time. So we created an angry thread emoji. Again, emojis, right? They're here to stay. We created an angry thread emoji, and anytime anyone on the team violated that team norm, we would all like react with that angry thread emoji. And it was not like a like a shameful thing, but it was like, hey, remember, we have this team norm. And now, like, being on other engagements with those same people, like, we are taking that practice and we're leveraging it elsewhere. And that's a big part of this. It kind of starts grassroots. A few people decide to try this thing. You immediately start to see the benefit, and then you implement it elsewhere. Another thing that you can do in that same vein is emojis. And I know, like, depending on which generation you identify with, you may have varying, maybe visceral reactions to emojis, but I would encourage you to embrace them because they're very much here to stay. One consultancy we work with has emoji engineers. So if you have a bad picture of you taken, you can bet that it will become an emoji sooner rather than later. But use emojis to represent reactions or actions. You can use emojis to vote on an issue. You can use emojis to vote whether or not you need a meeting. You can use emojis for like which way we're going to move forward. And maybe it's that we have a tie, so now we need to have a quick call to chat through it. Asynchronous doesn't mean that you're never talking to anybody. It just means that you're really intentional about when you pull people together. And then lastly, this seems kind of like a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised at how many like really long, unwieldy paragraphs I see in Teams and Slack. People aren't going to read those. They'll probably just call you if you post a really long paragraph in Slack or Teams. So a simple addition of a bulleted list is a great way to make what you're communicating in written form more accessible to people. I love a numbered list. So for me, I'll say like, hey, these are the next 5 things. Like, can you guys give me a status update? And in threaded or in that conversation, people will react with the status of like where those things are. So I can kind of get the update I need without having to like stop what I'm doing and pull everybody into a meeting to have a conversation. So I'm starting to tease out a little bit about what's next, and that's meetings. So meetings, if you can put in the chat, like what's your average time spent in meetings? We're on the low side, 4 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. That's great. 2 hours, that's great. Okay, I would say that you guys are not the norm, but that's awesome that it's that low. I find that people say that like meetings aren't work. I hate that. Meetings are work. They get a bad rap, but I think they're kind of like money. They're not like good or bad. It's really like how you use them. And a big misnomer in the asynchronous movement is that we're saying like no meetings, and that's not the case at all. It's just being more thoughtful about what requires us bringing everyone together. And if you need a driver for why we should work more asynchronously to your leadership, do the math on how much money a meeting costs based on the amount of people that are in the room and what their hours cost. And that's a really good driver to say like, do we need all these meetings? So how can we think about making our meetings matter? I'm going to kind of go through this because it's sort of a no-brainer, and go to this because I want to focus on how, and we're running out of time. So some ways that you can think about using meetings more intentionally. Send out your materials ahead of time for review so that people have time to digest what you're presenting before you present it, so they can come ready with questions. And if you have an ask, also send that out ahead of time. An agenda or a goal are really powerful ways to maximize the time that you spend in meetings. If you can't answer the question, like, why are we having this meeting? What are we trying to achieve here? You really probably like should not be having that meeting. And that can be a difficult thing, but I think if you start to force people to set a goal for meetings, it makes them be a little bit more thoughtful before they say, let's hop on a call. Schedule within boundaries decided on by your team. So if you agree, like no meetings after 5, you don't hop on a meeting after 5. Now, granted, again, back to that, it depends on who you are. If the CTO sends you a meeting invite for 5:15, you're probably not going to say, no, I can't. That's outside my working hours. Although in Australia you can. But it really depends on like who you are. So, but as a team, you know, if my teammate sends me a meeting, then I might say, hey, can we catch up about this tomorrow? That's kind of outside my scheduled working hours. And then this is really powerful as well. Use that optional attendee feature when inviting participants. So if you really don't need to be there and you attend anyways, if you're optional, you can't complain that it was time wasted because you are optional. And make sure that you don't make the decision makers optional. That maybe goes without saying, but I'll say it anyways. And then lastly, document the decisions and highlights for teams who couldn't attend or who were optional. Microsoft Teams is great with this because every meeting has a persistent chat. So you can kind of throw whatever you guys accomplished in the meeting in that persistent chat, and whomever was optional and wasn't able to attend is able to jump right in there and kind of get up to speed pretty quickly without having to be there, because certainly some people are double and triple booked. Okay. And then when you are holding your meetings, before, like I said, just quick recap, define your agenda or goal, share those artifacts for review. And then during, if you're having a hard time getting people to review the artifacts, build in a few minutes at the beginning to review them. I think it's Amazon that does that. I think that if you do that, you start to see people start to review them ahead of time, because nobody wants to be the one who was unprepared when everybody else had done the homework. Document those decisions made real time. You can either do that if you're the facilitator or ask a teammate to be in charge of doing that. That's a hat that can rotate as well. And then afterwards, if there are action items, publish them, and decisions for visibility and transparency so that people aren't missing out just because they weren't in the meeting. And then most importantly, if there needs to be a follow-up, set an agenda in the meeting so that everyone knows what they need to do before they come to the next one. This is maybe the most important part, but it's mindset. For a lot of us, this is going to require us to think a little bit differently about how we work. So firstly, grow gradually. Do this in small bites, and don't be super concerned with like correctness. Try to explore freely, do some things, see if it works. And if it doesn't, don't be afraid to walk it back. I give this talk at Agile conferences, and it sometimes maybe feels out of place. But this idea of like iterative improvement is really baked into how we embrace the idea of collaborating asynchronously. It's a new working pattern. And so grow gradually and learn all the time. Educate people on the benefits to keep people sort of engaged in this effort. Set really clear expectations. That goes back to that empathy piece, right? If you're asking people to be super transparent about where they are and what they're doing, you cannot then weaponize that information against them. So you have to set really clear expectations about the fact that we are giving people the time and space to be their best selves at work. And so that may mean that they're not always 100% available for synchronous communication, and that's okay. It's okay if they're working at Starbucks for in the morning. It's okay that they went for a walk to think through that test case, things like that. Learn from success and failures. I coach youth basketball. We learn from failure a lot, but also learn from success. If there are things that you do that work, always be looking for ways to repeat it and to scale it. I am a big advocate of Slack stand-ups or Microsoft asynchronous stand-ups where possible. I implemented that on a couple teams I was working with, and before long, leadership got a hold of it, and I was doing a presentation to all the teams in the space about how to do asynchronous stand-ups effectively. That's what I mean by that grassroots thing. Once people start to feel the benefits, they're a lot more willing to sort of try something new. As a team, a great place to start is a kickoff. Pull together a strategy to kick off the effort for your team. Highlight those benefits and the need for an open mind and next steps. Let the team sort of decide how they want to do it. I mentioned earlier, I have a great workshop for how to do team norms around asynchronous working specifically. So maybe you have an exercise for teams to think about how asynchronous collaboration can work for them, and they pick 2 things to do, and then you give it a try. And then empower teams to sort of define their own approach. This doesn't have to be like a one-size-fits-all experience. Teams can do it in different ways depending upon what works best for them. And likely those conversations will lead you to a very quick conversation about tools, because if you're collaborating asynchronously, more than likely you need a tool to do it. That does not mean go buy new tools. If you go to leadership and say, we need a bunch of money for tools so we can work asynchronously, okay, let's go. No one's going to say yes to that, right? But take a look at the tools you have available to you and let those team norm sessions drive that tool selection. So maybe it's email. Maybe the feedback is like, when we try to collaborate over email, it gets like super confusing and the chains get really long and people respond to just 2 or 3 people and I get lost. So we say, okay, we're going to move that type of collaboration into Google Docs. And instead of in an email, we're going to put it in a Google Doc and we're going to use comments. We don't need to buy anything extra. We already have those tools available. We're just going to be intentional about how we use them. And like I said, that's a lot of this is just looking at what you already have and being intentional about setting guidelines on how to use those tools and have shared understanding about how. It also might be that people don't know how to use the tools that you have. And depending on the level of psychological safety at your organization, it's very unlikely that someone's going to raise their hand and say, I don't know how to use whatever tool that you've been using for 10 years. That's probably not going to happen. So reflect as a team or as leadership, like, what are the happy practices? What are the best ways that we as a team, because best can be subjective, that we as a team want to use this tool, and put together some quick training on like how to at somebody in a Google Doc, how to leverage a Miro board for collaboration, how to use how to create a Microsoft Teams channel, whatever the case may be. Make sure that everybody has a shared understanding about how to execute that happy practice instead of just assuming that they do. And then lastly, we want this to happen. We want this to continue. We want this to live on past maybe our tenure at the company. So how do we be intentional about making it natural? So leadership is key, right? I mean, I think that's true of any transformation. A lot of the transformations that I work on, the lack of leadership buy-in is like the brick wall that everybody's hurtling at 80 miles an hour. So try to find a champion in leadership to sort of be your advocate. If you can't, it's okay. You can still start small. If you start small and get some gains, you can point to those increase productivity, increase morale, increase happiness, increase efficiency, and then maybe you can get leadership on board. Stay out of the way. Don't try to be overly prescriptive and say everybody must do it this way. There's a lot, like flexibility is the name of the game here, right? So get out of the way and let this thing grow as organically as it can. It's going to look really different at lots of different organizations, and there's a lot of different places to start and a lot of different places you can go with it. Key here, right? My Agilist hat always on. Regularly collect that feedback. Create space for people to give you that feedback, to be open to receiving it. Maybe it's a retro once a quarter. Like, how are we doing in our asynchronous practice? What things do you like? What things do you hate? You have to make it work for the people doing it. Again, it's not a one size fits all. So leave that door open for regularly collecting feedback. Encourage experience sharing. Maybe it's a channel simply dedicated to asynchronous wins where someone could say, hey, we're using Slack stand-ups to great effect, or like, hey, I'm using threads in my DMs with somebody that I'm collaborating on. And like the founder of Endash, like his and I, like DM is just like one sentence with like 30 messages embedded in each thread because we're collaborating on a bunch of different things all the time. And so it's how we keep ourselves organized. And that's something that I can share out with everybody else so that they can use it too. And then lastly, like when in doubt, talk it out. And it may seem sort of like counterintuitive in a talk about being asynchronous to say like schedule time to talk through how to be asynchronous. But the reality is that the gains that you will get by like taking some synchronous time to define these asynchronous behaviors is like by design a compounding impact on productivity. And so like when I talk to people about working this way, they're always struggling with like how to scale it. It seems to be like the question around everything we implement these days, which like with good reason, right? Because we want these things to be like, we're always looking for repeatable patterns. Remember that this is an example at its heart of a culture shift. And so it's a different way to think about how we work together. And so in this case, like gradual is a really good thing. It can be as simple as setting like don't say good morning, a no hello norm on your team, or to as complex as cutting your calendar in half and only allowing meetings in the morning. There's no one size fits all. It's really a matter of like surveying your landscape, pinpointing the places where you feel like you can gradually start to shift the needle and implement some of these strategies so that everybody can start to become a sustainably more efficient version of themselves. And so in closing, I just wanted to give you a couple other, like, if this interests you, a couple other like resources and further reading. That QR code is again a way to connect back with me and with us at Endash. So if you have further questions beyond what I'm going to be able to answer here, I would love to hear from you. If you want to challenge what I said and say like, there's no way that this will work, I would love that as well. I would love to have a conversation about that as well. So I welcome that feedback also. So thank you all so much for the time.